showing up? Oh, cool. Okay, awesome. So, so I'm going to talk about data when it's not super great, or maybe doesn't exist at all. My name is Eva Galanes-Rosenbaum. I'm the Media and Public Opinion Analyst for Rethink Media. I'm based in the Bay Area. We also have an office in DC. And basically, this is what I've been telling a lot of people as I meet them. We operate a bit like a nonprofit version of a PR firm, except that the issues are our clients rather than individual companies or organizations. So we work with coalitions of nonprofit organizations, we call them collaboratives, to help them essentially do media better. So we provide them with capacity building and training and analysis. So my job is to try to answer 3 questions. How does the media cover our issues? How does the public think about our issues? And what can we say, or what can our members say, to change their minds? So, given the rising importance of data stories in driving media attention, there's constant pressure on our member organizations, and therefore on me, to back up our messages with data. It's really the same reason that all of us are here for the 4th year in a row. So if we say that anti-Muslim rhetoric leads to more hate crimes against those perceived to be Muslim, can we actually show that? Similarly, when we want to question the efficacy of and fallout of the drone killing program or the targeted airstrike program, do we actually have numbers on the casualties and attacks that take place? We want to tell data stories because they matter. But what happens when all we have are anecdotes and incomplete data sets? This talk is basically about maintaining methodological integrity in the face of a desire to tell really important stories that affect real people's lives and should go beyond the anecdotal level, but where data to do that doesn't really already exist. So I'm going to suggest 4 strategies for telling data stories without good data. And a quick note, against all of my academic training, I'm going to use data as a singular here because that's the way the world is going. Sorry, Professor Gronke. So, all right, the first strategy is proxy data. We use proxy data all the time, so often that those of us who work with data or actually who work in politics probably never think about it. Typical examples of proxy data are tree rings and ice cores. Climatology uses these kinds of measurements in lieu of actual mercury readings and rainfall inches to track climate data over centuries and millennia. In politics, we have a different set of typical proxy data sources. So party affiliation is a proxy for vote choice in a world where we have a secret ballot. And whether your county has a Whole Foods or a Cracker Barrel is a proxy for socioeconomic status and a range of other demographic attributes. So the targeted airstrike or drone killing program is technically classified even now. The government really doesn't release data on it, and the most widely quoted source on drones in news articles is some permutation of unnamed federal official. So the Bureau of Investigative Journalism compiled news reports from Pakistan and other countries where drone killings happen, using these on-the-ground reports as proxy data for American drone activity. Pitch Interactive created this data visualization from the Bureau's data. They were inspired by the periscopic gun deaths visualization that you might remember from last year's Tapestry or other places, to show the impact of the drone program and to question claims that civilian casualties had been low or non-existent. And actually, just yesterday, the Obama administration announced that it will finally release how many deaths have resulted from drone strikes since 2009, sometime in the next few weeks. So that's a big win. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay. The second strategy is corroboration. It's basically a kind of dodgy version of replication. This could be called the Venn diagram method or even the Nate Silver method. The idea here is that little data sets each have their own problems, but overlaying a few of them can tell us something, at least about the places where they overlap, and sometimes it will tell us important things about the gaps in our knowledge. I use this method frequently, very much like Nate Silver, to examine public opinion. Polls are notoriously flawed, even the very best ones. But we can be reasonably sure that if, say, 3 polls show majority opposition to the Citizens United decision, that opposition is real. One of the issues that Rethink Media works on is nuclear nonproliferation, including encouraging diplomacy with Iran over its nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the most polled issues I've ever seen in my time at Rethink. And as you can see from this chart, support for the deal was estimated at anywhere from 29% to 78%, which is a lot more variation than we normally see in public opinion data. What we could tell when we overlaid all the polling data on this chart is that public support for the deal was probably somewhere in the range of 60% before the deal was finalized, and about 45 to 50% after it was announced in July last year. Using corroboration techniques, though, we actually have a richer data set that can attempt to answer a secondary question. Not just what do people think, but actually what makes them change their minds? What causes the fluctuation in all of these results? Most Americans didn't really know much about the deal with Iran. In fact, even I didn't actually know that much about it, even though I work on this issue. Because calling it a wonky subject area is to vastly undersell its complexity. So in the absence of real understanding of an issue, most of us fall back on partisan signaling. Basically, Republicans opposed the deal, and Democrats mostly supported it. And that explains quite a lot of the polling results that we saw. But there was a lot of variation amongst these polls in how the question of support was actually asked, including how much information people were given in the actual question. So I used the character length of the question as a proxy measurement for the amount of information included. Again, there's wide variation on what kinds of information, but that was my proxy measurement, and I plotted support against amount of information. And as you can see, there is a correlation between the more information people get and the amount of support that they give to the deal in a poll. Okay, this approach might seem like the most obvious to us. If you want to tell a data story and you don't have the data, go collect it, right? Easier said than done. But there are instances in which this is not only the best approach, it opens up new lines of investigation, brand new stories that you can tell. A small team called 416 Labs started with a fact and a feeling. Their fact was media coverage on Islam and Muslims has increased hugely in the last few years, even compared to the decade following 9/11. Their feeling, and this is a feeling shared by many in the Muslim community, is that a disproportionate amount of that coverage is negative. No data on this topic. So they created it. They scored New York Times headlines that included the word Muslim or Islam or Islamic by the frequency of positive and negative words in those headlines. And they found that their hypothesis was correct, that headlines about Islam and Muslims are, in fact, a lot more negative than a lot of topics, including topics like cancer and heroin. The Sikh Coalition started with an experience that's common in their community. Wearing a turban in an airport, as Sikh men do, singles you out for discrimination from TSA agents. But when they complained to the TSA and pushed for rule changes and more training, the TSA denied receiving a high volume of complaints from Sikh men. So the Sikh Coalition created an app called Fly Rights, which allows you to report discriminatory experiences as soon as they happen from the airport. And it gives the Sick Coalition lots of data on TSA discrimination. So this is the trickiest of the four methods. When you want to tell a story, but your data set is, shall we say, dodgy or spotty, you can supplement it with anecdotal evidence. Take, for example, hate crimes. I work on really uplifting issues, I know. So when we saw the surge in hate crimes against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim following the Paris attacks, many of us asked the obvious question, or rather obvious for data nerds, is this a real increase or is it a perceived increase? That is there just a lot more awareness and reporting on it, or is it actually an increase? As with so many things in the US, reliable national data on hate crimes is non-existent. The best data sets we have are from the FBI, and there are so many things wrong with their methodology, I can't actually talk about them all here. But one really important thing to know is that the FBI doesn't release its annual stats until November the following year. So this article is from 2015, in November. It's about the 2014 hate crime statistics. We won't have the deeply flawed FBI hate crime statistics about the time around Paris and San Bernardino until November this year. But here's what the last 13 years looked like in their data. The article that I just showed, and this one, and many others like it, have used the data story as context, but shifted the focus of the story away from the overall trend over the last 15 years. And they've put the focus on supplementary anecdotes. So the story focuses on that question mark for 2015, and then they illustrate why the Southern Poverty Law Center speculates that the number will continue to rise by giving specific and relatable anecdotes, basically giving people a sense of what hate crimes actually look like, what actually is happening, and gives them a bit more of a way to see into the data, even though we don't have stats for 2015 yet. If you're telling a data story, it's important to use solid methodology at any point. If you don't have good data, it's even more important. So I suggest 4 preliminary rules to follow. One is be transparent. Don't try to hide the quality of your data. Whether you are basing your conclusions on a preponderance of evidence or the merest hint of it, make that clear to your audience. Be conservative. Use healthy caution whenever you're analyzing data and extra caution when using sketchy data. Don't hold back from telling a story if you think it's warranted, but it's usually better to ask questions than make statements when you don't have a lot to go on. Be exhaustive, or don't be lazy. Make sure you really do have your hands on the best data available, however little that is, rather than concluding that there's really nothing after just one page of Google results. And finally, be open. This, again, applies to any data analysis. Be open to what the data might tell you and what it might not tell you. You may decide after exhaustive exploration that there isn't a there, and that's better than going forward with something when you don't really have anything to support it. So I'm going to conclude by telling you why it's a good idea to tell data stories without great or even good data. As I said at the beginning, we want to tell stories that matter. And at some point, a group of anecdotes becomes an issue, a phenomenon, a mechanism, a systemic problem. At that point, it becomes a data story. But there are a lot of important stories out there that really should be data stories, but aren't being told because the data sets don't exist or aren't good. When that's the case, the story might be the lack of data. In our age of big data and declining civics knowledge, many Americans are amazed that there isn't comprehensive or even fully reliable data on many aspects of society. In fact, even I am amazed sometimes. So when I wanted to interrogate the common sense liberal assumption that there had been an increase in deaths at police hands last year, I was surprised to find that we actually don't know because we don't have measurements. And The Guardian was similarly surprised. So they did a huge article, big multi-article piece about it. Sometimes that is the story. The story is we don't know enough, and someone, the government, academia, the media, amateur data nerds, someone should find out. When we talk about the lack of data on something important, we can use that as a catalyst for responsibility, for transparency, and ultimately, hopefully, for change. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Eva. So, any questions for Eva?
While we're doing questions, would Jessica Holman come up and get mic'd up in the front?
Real quick question. Will Stens from Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I find myself in very similar situations where I'm telling an incomplete story that just got presented, say, this morning to a CEO of a major company that is now, whether or not after the fact, has implications to the business itself in kind of a major way. So after that happens and you find more data or the data gets better, how have you gone about rectifying that, especially if the initial analysis proved to be false?
That is a very good question. Yeah. So I think it depends a lot on the context in which you're presenting your initial findings. You know, in the interest of full disclosure, most of the data analysis that I do is presented to a pretty small audience. It's fairly proprietary. But even in those situations, sometimes you find that, oh, your data has improved and actually turns out you're wrong. That happens all the time for me with public opinion analysis. And yeah, I think it depends on your audience. But overall, my main piece of advice is be totally upfront and give your audience an explanation about why something has changed and your original analysis or conclusion wasn't correct. You know, in public opinion, we rely very heavily on pretty flawed polling data, basically flawed because the questions aren't asked as precisely as we'd want or, you know, as unbiasedly as we would like. And giving people an explanation about why that happened and what makes you think your new conclusion is more reliable, that's really important. Giving them enough to kind of hold on to.
This is Jersey. So in addition to the other ways that data can be flawed that you've talked about today, there's also the issue of statistical precision and having margins of error that are big enough you can't draw a conclusion even though you have the point estimates, it looks like you have the data, it looks like you should be able to say this number is bigger.
Yeah.
Have you found good ways to explain that and convey that to people who aren't trained in that background?
Yeah. I mean, I get asked questions about statistical significance all the time. And as you can imagine, especially in small data sets, you almost never find statistical significance, if you even have enough data to do any kind of real statistical analysis. My strategy is usually, again, to be really forthcoming about what I'm seeing and why I'm hesitant to draw a conclusion that would otherwise seem pretty obvious to someone, to a layperson looking at two numbers and saying, like, B is definitely bigger than A, so why can't we just say it's statistically significant or even significant? And what I'll usually tell them is, okay, you know, there are a lot of reasons that we can't actually draw that complete conclusion. And one of them is, you know, maybe your data set is really small and we actually don't have a complete picture. One of them might be that there are all these holes. One of them might be that we're expecting more data to come out later and we want to be really conservative about what we say. So usually, for me anyway, I'm trying to give our members some language that they can use to talk about polling or media coverage or something, and I'll try to give them a really succinct way of explaining that, we're seeing what we think is a trend in this direction. We're waiting for more data to find out if that's true, but here are the reasons why we think that the trend is going this way. Or it looks like that number is bigger than this number, and we're pretty sure that that's true, but we don't want to say, definitely that's the case. So giving people, again, something to hold on to, some sense that they understand the difference between statistical significance and, one number looks bigger than the other. Even if you don't use that terminology, I think that's hugely important for people kind of understanding how to explain something.
Hey, I'm RJ. So this is really awesome, and I really like the idea of the story is the lack of data. But when that isn't the story and you still want to use all these tactics to tell a different story, how, as a community, do we move to a space where we acknowledge missing data, gaps in data, without losing our storytelling authority? Because I find that once you start talking about what you don't know, then you lose that authority.
Yeah.
And which is one of the reasons why I think we don't acknowledge the gaps in our data.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my strategies is to talk about why the story is important, how we know what we do know, and what we're seeing in the data that we have, and really hammering home the connections that people can make, either anecdotal connections or putting yourself. It kind of gets back a little bit to what Trina was talking about. With polling data, a lot of my strategy is talking about what we think we know, drawing parallels from one issue to another so that kind of like it builds out what we know a little bit more, and also puts someone in the position of thinking about their own experiences, thinking about their own like demographic makeup, and trying to identify with, this is the story that I want to tell about myself, and these are some stories about other people whose demographic makeup looks really different from mine, but this is how they're thinking about it. So, again, putting the focus on why it's an important story and what we actually do know, and just moving that acknowledgement of gaps in data, maybe to the end of the story instead of the beginning, and not leading with that, but still being totally upfront and acknowledging. And also, I think it can go a long way in that like methodology or data or whatever sources section, to simply say, we want there to be better data on this. Here's a suggestion that we have. Either the government needs to collect this piece of data, they need to release this piece of data, or we would like to see more news organizations doing this, or more, nonprofits doing that, whatever it is. But, kind of pushing it in a direction and moving the focus away from the lack of data.
Right. Thanks. Let's thank Eva again.